No, she's back. She's back. Don't worry, Jackson. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started on time because that's I'm trying to defy stereotypes. So welcome everyone. My name is Katie Kalaitis, and this is the first event in what we're calling workshops in Eastern Christian studies. But as this event proves, is not just about Eastern Christian studies, but sort of broader topics that connect somehow to the Christian East, but aren't necessarily just grounded in them. And this is a little project that I've started with Father David Williams. He's unable to join us tonight, unfortunately, because he is ill. But we wish him well, and hopefully he'll be better. He has approximately 44 days to get better before busy season for Orthodox priests. So he better get on it. So no, thank you so much for being here. My family, the reason I'm interested in this, and then I'll turn it over to our brilliant panelists. When my mother's family came to the United States, they went to Carbon County, Utah, and later then to Salt Lake. And when my father's family came to the United States, they went to Independence, Missouri, which, needless to say, gave my family on both sides some misinformation about the demographic realities of the United States. And so in the popular, I grew up in a family where, calling someone Americani, calling someone a Mormoni was synonymous with calling them Americani, right? We saw, in my understanding, for a very long time, and then I grew up in a majority Mormon neighborhood in Denver. In my understanding, American religion sort of was the Restoration tradition. And I was shocked when I learned that demographically, that is not exactly the truth. So I was always, my first sort of ecumenical encounters were with people from the Restoration tradition. And when I started working sort of in academic spaces about religion and religious history, I was shocked that didn't happen more because there are so many parallels. And I will, before I turn it over, there is a great line in a newspaper article from Chicago in 1917, when a journalist goes out to Carbon County, where my family is at this point, and writes, "The Greeks and the Mormons, they deserve each other. Strange and insular people, certain that their small tribe is in possession of the only true religion on the face of the earth." So I am very excited about this. I'm particularly excited because I think you have these two sort of mother churches that are at the center of some very dramatic current events, and I'm interested to hear those parallels. So without further ado, because I know we are tight on time, we'll start with our first speaker who has graciously agreed to be the first speaker. Professor Philip Dorrell is an associate professor of religious studies at Woodruff College in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and the co-chair of the Eastern Orthodox Studies Unit at the American Academy of Religion. His research and writing focus on the history of Islamic and Orthodox Christian theology in Arabic and Turkish, and the relations of Orthodox Christian and Orthodox Christian Muslim relations. And so without further ado, the floor is yours, Professor.
Thanks very much for having me. I really am excited to be here. I just completed some research on this topic recently, so this is a good time for me to talk about it. Can you all see my screen right now? Cool. All right. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of the conversion of Hagia Sophia from a museum into a mosque in July of 2020. I'll save all of the details on its Byzantine Orthodox significance for Father Lucas, who knows more about that than I do. But I'll give a quick timeline here to get us started off. What I'm going to argue or talk about here basically are the reasons why the reconversion rather, from Hagia Sophia or Hagia Sophia in Turkish, the reasons why it was a popular item for President Erdogan to transition it from a museum into a mosque in 2020, why that resonated with much of the Turkish populace, and the historic background for the movement to accomplish that task. I'm going to distinguish between two different kinds of Turkish religious discourses on Hagia Sophia, one of them coming from a popular traditional stream of Turkish Muslim piety that's actually quite apolitical, And the second, a much more political nationalist strain of thought that talks about Hagia Sophia. And I'll talk about how Erdogan sort of brought these two streams together to create a movement and to transition Hagia Sophia from a museum into a mosque. So my basic question here that I want us to talk about and maybe answer is, what is the reason for the poll, the kind of support that I'll talk about here in this Turkish opinion poll very quickly? This is from a Metropol survey, which is sort of the premier or one of the premier public opinion polling outfits in Turkey. Still very good to this day. Highly recommend their work. According to Metropol, in June of 2020, so just a few weeks before the decision to transition Hagia Sophia from a museum into a mosque, 46% of Turks supported that decision, and 43% supported keeping it as a museum. So quite evenly divided among Turkish voters, which is very characteristic of Turkish politics in the past 15 so years, especially under Recep Tayyip Erdogan's presidency. Population has been very evenly divided in support of his agenda and opposed to his agenda for well over a decade. In that breakdown, the party that he represents, the AKP, 70.7% of his voters in his party supported reconversion, and a minority, about a quarter of them, supported keeping it a museum. And then among the primary opposition party, about the same percentage, 70-odd% of the opposition party's voters supported keeping it as a museum, opposed to reconverting it to a mosque, and only a minority supported keeping it, I made a mistake there on the bottom. Only a minority supported converting it into a mosque. So you have basically Turkish public opinion evenly divided at the time of the reconversion, right down the middle. Those who are in support of Erdogan's agenda strongly favor it. Those who are opposed to it, opposed to Erdogan's agenda, are opposed to the reconversion. Basic historical timeline that I'll leave the details for a few other presenters. But of course, in 532, 537, Hagia Sophia is built by Emperor Justinian. I also want to quickly point out all the photographs of Hagia Sophia in this presentation are by Istanbul photographer Vural Yazıcıoğlu. So credit to him for the really excellent. And these photos are quite current. They were taken in the winter of 2022. So they represent a fairly 2023, I think. They represent winter of 2022. They represent a current state of the building. 1453, of course, Constantinople falls, and Hagia Sophia is converted into Hagia Sophia, the Mosque of Hagia Sophia, by the Emperor Mehmed II, the conqueror of Istanbul. In 1847, 1849, the interior of the building takes the shape that it has now. Repairs done to the inside, the hanging of the great calligraphic roundels that are characteristic of it now. The way it looks on the inside now is largely a product of the restoration efforts under Abdülmecid I, who famously wanted to uncover many of the mosaics as a kind of museum display at the time. He himself was very supportive of uncovering those and opening them to the public and keeping them. But public opinion was opposed to that, so he kind of backed down in the face of public opinion on that question. But famously, when he replastered over the mosaics that were uncovered in the 30s later, the ones that are famous now, when he replastered them over, he commanded that it be done in a way so that it wouldn't damage them, so that at some later date, they could be recovered when public opinion was prepared for that. 1923, Turkish Republic is founded, of course, by President Atatürk. 1934, an act of parliament converts Hagia Sophia into a museum, signed by Atatürk. And then in July 10th of 2020, the 10th chamber of the Danıştay, the high court, one of the high court circuit in Turkey, in the capital Ankara, nullifies that ruling, and President Erdogan signs a presidential decree on the 10th, commanding that it be converted into a mosque or opened up to Muslim worship in particular. July 24th of 2020, Friday prayers are held for the first time at Hagia Sophia since the closing of the mosque in 1934. So my main thesis here that I want to emphasize and that I want to get across to people is that there are two, we can think about the Turkish support for this conversion, this reconversion, in two different ways. One of those streams of piety, one of those streams of thought is a deep traditional Turkish pious attachment to Hagia Sophia. as a symbol of Ottoman Islamic and Turkish heritage that is not particularly political, but is simply invested in the meaning of the building as this great center and incubator for Turkish Islamic tradition, which it was. Once it became a mosque, it became a great center of Islamic learning and culture in the Ottoman Empire. It became the template for all future mosque building. It became the sort of beating heart of the Turkish Muslim spiritual tradition. And so for many Turks, the Hagia Sophia doesn't represent a particular political position per se. It represents the core of their pious faith tradition. The way they pray, the way they think about theology and Islamic identity is intimately connected with that building, because that building was in fact the place where many of those traditions were formed. So this is what when I talk about Hagia Sophia as an emblem of Turkish Islamic piety and tradition, not precisely politics per se. A good example of this is a book that I have a picture of here, a book by Ömer Nasuhi Bilmen, who's one of the most influential late Ottoman, early Turkish Republic authors and theologians and scholars who wrote he wrote a ton of things, but he wrote a famous catechism in Ilmi Hal that is still standard in one of the most widely read Muslim books in Islamic texts in Turkey. In 1953, he published this book called Fethi Suresi Tefsiri, the sort of formal interpretation hermeneutics of this chapter in the Quran, talking about the victory of Islam over polytheism in the Arabian Peninsula. And he published it to help commemorate the 500-year anniversary of 1453, of the conquest of Istanbul, of Constantinople by the Ottomans. But his thesis in his text was that that conquest and Hagia Sophia should have for Turks today, in his time in the early Republic, that the significance of that conquest should be interpreted in a spiritual sense, and that the superiority of Islam should be interpreted as its theological truth and its ethical ideals. So he argued that Hagia Sophia is important to Muslim Turks because it represents Islam's truth and its ethical virtues, and that we should interpret the conquest spiritually as a kind of indication that Turkish believers should, in his words, engage in, quote, their own beautiful actions, which he defines as virtuous deeds and scholarly effort, the advancement of Islamic scholarly knowledge and virtuous deeds as a way to support and spread Islam. So this is a very traditional, actually, traditional, even Ottoman way of talking about history, as kind of having these spiritual lessons, these inner spiritual meanings that the everyday believer can take with them and use to advance their common piety, the common virtues, the common worship virtues of getting close to God, and also the virtues of loving kindness between human beings. So he interprets Hagia Sophia and 1453 as a call to Turkish believers to reinvest themselves in their tradition. And he explicitly says, I don't see this as a moment that we should interpret in its political sense as a kind of worldly domination, instead a kind of spiritual superiority that we should cultivate as Turkish Muslim believers inspired by our Ottoman roots. A second narrative about Turkish Islamic attachment to Hagia Sophia develops in the Republic as well, and this is a very explicitly nationalist and political connotation to it, whereas scholars like Bilmen and the sort of late Ottoman theological piety tradition are in general much more focused on cultivating virtue and worship and piety among the average Muslim believer and the theological tradition of the faith. A second political movement is developing at the same time that is explicitly looking at Hagia Sophia as a representation of the failure of Turkish Islamic national aspirations. In this narrative, Hagia Sophia is the center of Turkish Islamic national identity, and its conversion to a museum was termed quickly an historic betrayal, an ihanet, of the Turkish Muslim nation. This term, ihanet, is a very important term. We'll see it run through all of this particular nationalist discourse about Hagia Sophia beginning in the 30s, all the way up until Erdogan's speech about the reconversion in 2020, that the conversion of Hagia Sophia from a mosque into a museum by Ataturk was a betrayal of Turkishness, a betrayal of the Turkish national identity, and that wrong has to be righted in order for the Turkish nation to progress. This discourse begins quickly in the early history of the Republic. One of the most famous early examples is by writer Osman Yüksel Serdengeçti, who in 1952 wrote an article that was probably the first public call to reconvert it back into a mosque, which Bilmen did not call for, interestingly, in his book. But this sort of more nationalist strain absolutely did. That call got him arrested and indicted on potentially even a death penalty charge by the secular government, which he got thrown out of court, but he spent time in prison for that opinion. In 1968, the famous Turkish Islamist nationalist Necip Fazıl Kısakürek writes a famous article where he describes the conversion of Hagia Sophia into a museum as a, pardon me, I'm always checking my time here, I don't want to go over, as a betrayal of Turkish history, the greatest of betrayals to Turkish history, its sanctity, its spirit. Other Islamists at the time, like Sezai Karakoç, have the same opinion. 73, Kısakürek issues his famous declaration at a conference in Istanbul, where he says, "Let the chains be broken, let Hagia Sophia be opened." And breaking the chains of Hagia Sophia's of captivity under the secularists becomes the kind of language and rallying cry for this movement to reopen Hagia Sophia to Muslim worship in the ensuing decades. And the book here I have a picture of is by a Turkish MP from the Islamist part of the Refah Partisi. He published in 93, also got him arrested and tossed into prison. And it's called in Turkish the Hagia Sophia betrayal. So Erdogan, in his rationale for doing this, very deftly synthesizes these two discourses. And in his July 10 speech that he issues immediately after he signs the decree to reconvert it, he says, indeed, the original conversion was a betrayal of history, using that exact same term. He quotes another Turkish nationalist Islamist from the middle of the 20th century saying, quote, Hagia Sophia's transformation into a museum did not fend off Christianity's designs on Istanbul. On the contrary, it emboldened them, incited and exacerbated them. So talking about the original conversion of Hagia Sophia into a museum as part of Christianity, here Greek Orthodoxies, hidden potential to betray the Turkish nation if left to its own devices. And you talked about how this was basically all part of God's plan for the Turkish nation, the status of Hagia Sophia as a vakuf, as a waqf, as a endowment under Turkish or Islamic ritual law, gave it a sacred status that no one should be able to contravene, and that he's restoring. His main changes to the interior were addition of green carpet, these grand chandeliers to help light, to make the space look more like an Ottoman mosque, and the covering of the icons, which you can see here, the curtains over the icons prominent over the mihrab, the altar area, and a few additional calligraphic panels. Finally, just two quotes to end my presentation here. I think the major issue with all of this was identified, in fact, by Archbishop Elpidophoros of America, who wrote a series of responses to this announcement. In the sermon given by the president of the Turkish Director of Religious Affairs on that first Friday prayer service, he described the occasion as the opening of Hagia Sophia to worship, to Muslim worship, to ibadat, is the firm resolve to construct, with spiritual power taken from its roots, a secure future for our glorious nation that above all else holds on to the love of faith and homeland. So a very straightforward declaration of Turkish Islamic nationalism as being the core of all this. Elpidophoros of America, who is himself an Istanbul, native of Istanbul, had delivered a sermon on shortly, a few hours after that prayer service, declaring that day a day of mourning, July 24th, 2020. And a year later, he very succinctly summarized and very specifically identified the problem with the reconversion. And it's not a problem with I would say it's not a problem with the pious Turkish attachment to the space, which makes some sense to me, at least historically and traditionally, and is not necessarily a political action for many Turks. But he identified the problem, which is very succinctly that in the action that Erdogan took, the space was misappropriated and done so in order to send a message to religious minorities and to appeal to misplaced nationalistic fervor. So Elpidophoros, I think, is correct that the problem with the move is that it was a concession and an exacerbation and an affirmation of religious nationalism on the part of Erdogan, where Erdogan, like he often does, uses the kind of pious sentiment among everyday believers to strengthen his own particular kind of religious nationalism. And that's my bit of time for today.
Myself. Thank you so much. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, we're going to have people hold questions to the end. This is a webinar, so you can ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to those in the end. Our next speaker is Professor Casey Paul Griffiths from Brigham Young University. Professor Griffiths was born and raised in Delta, Utah. I know where that is. And served a mission in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where everyone should know that where that is. He holds a BA in history from Brigham Young University and later completed his MA in religious education and a PhD in educational leadership and foundations at BYU. His studies focus on the development of religious education programs among Latter-day Saints. Prior to joining the faculty in religious education at BYU, his research focused on the history of religious education among Latter-day Saints, the history of the church in the Pacific, and the diverse movements associated with the Restoration. Professor Griffiths. You're muted.
Thank you. I wanted to say I've been to Carbon County and I've seen the Greek Orthodox Church there, and it's lovely. Can you see my slides on screen? Is that showing up now?
You can see your slides, and you saw the church where my grandparents were married.
And it was lovely. We went and stayed in Helper and like to visit different churches out here in that area. So that was a nice little bit of connection.
Lovely.
What I'm talking about is a little bit newer than the Hagia Sophia. And John's going to talk a little bit about it too, and I don't want to overlap with John, but I would suppose that the big news that has spread through the last couple weeks is a transfer of historic properties and artifacts from one church, Community of Christ, to another church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm a member of the LDS Church. I'm a professor at Brigham Young University, but I also work with an interfaith team that communicates with leaders from Community of Christ. In fact, we're having a meeting tomorrow, and David, who you see on the webinar too, is part of it. We had planned a topic to discuss for our meeting, but about a week and a half ago, everything got thrown off because this agreement between the two churches was announced, and now we're talking about different things. But at the heart of it is this structure that you see in the photograph here. This is the Kirtland Temple, which Community of Christ and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints both started out as the same church. There were schisms along the way. This structure was the very first temple built in our faith tradition. And as such, to almost every church that has ties back to Joseph Smith and the Restoration, it's a sacred structure. Now, the agreement, which was announced jointly by the church, this is what the announcement looked like, announced that the centerpiece was the Kirtland Temple, which is located in Kirtland, Ohio, just south of Cleveland, but also clarified in a frequently asked questions document that was released at the same time too, that would also involve the transfer of a number of historic artifacts. So this is one example of that. These are manuscripts of Joseph Smith's Bible revision that he worked on during his prophetic tenure. Other things like the Bible that Joseph Smith studied from. This is a document referred to as the Characters document, which is believed to have on it characters transcribed from the gold plates that Joseph Smith used in Book of Mormon translation. And then a number of other historic sites in Nauvoo, including the Mansion House. This is where Joseph Smith's body was displayed during his funeral. The Nauvoo House, all these have been under stewardship of Community of Christ. And so it was a kind of an interesting day for me because when the agreement was announced and I found out about it on social media, I was reading a Facebook post from David Howlett, who's in this meeting, and that was where I became aware of it. And it was pretty overwhelming. At the same time, too, I think a lot of people felt a number of emotions. There were some people in my church that were elated, that were overjoyed, that these sacred structures had come into our stewardship. A lot of my friends are members of Community of Christ. They were very, very sad over the transfer. I watched John's sermon that he gave in his church on Sunday and was deeply touched by what he had to say as well. But all of this goes back to this idea of shared sacred space. So it's interesting to me to contemplate that every time I've been to the Kirtland Temple, and I've been quite a number of times, it's been a member of Community of Christ escorting me through the temple. It's been because of their courtesy and their grace that I was able to go into this sacred structure. And part of the reason why we feel that this structure is so sacred is we believe that this is a house of God, that it was dedicated. And Joseph Smith said that a vision of Jesus Christ, of Moses, Elias, and Elijah took place within this building as well. And I've had the opportunity to go into this building on an early Sunday morning, and um, through the generosity of a leader from Community of Christ, had an opportunity to kneel down and say my own prayer in what I consider a sacred space. And then go upstairs where you can see those nice little windows are, and there's a number of offices arranged, and have the opportunity to have a discussion, an interfaith dialogue, where we talk about the two faiths and how they've diverged, what they have in common, what points they can connect on, and how we can work together and move forward together. And so this is, like I said, something that I'm happy about, but I've also met with mixed emotions, because one of the things that I've covenanted to do is comfort those that stand in need of comfort and mourn with those that mourn. And I understand that the transfer of a building like this is often met with mourning on one side, rejoicing on the other, and I hope that we meet together and see it as a sacred shared space. So for me, it's a little overwhelming to think that the next time I go to Kirtland, the tables could be turned, and I could be a person escorting a member of Community of Christ through the temple. And I would hope that if I find myself in those circumstances, I would find the courtesy and the graciousness that they've always shown to me as well. It's a remarkable thing that a sacred space like this can pass from one church to another with no physical violence, I guess you'd say. At the same time, too, I recognize that there may be some trauma, emotional and psychological, that comes from seeing a building like this go out of a person's hand. So I'm grateful that the building is in the stewardship of my church, but I recognize and honor those that have kept it sacred and special for years and years, because it's, to me, one of those sacred spaces where in my faith tradition, it's just about the earliest building that Latter-day Saints were able to construct together. And the fact that it's still there is a monument to the people that have had stewardship and have taken care of it to this point. So it's been an interesting couple of days, and I think an emotional roller coaster for a lot of people, because this is something that I didn't really think was going to happen. It was something that I didn't anticipate happening, and now that it's happening, I'm still sort of trying to process exactly what it means and how things change moving forward. But I will just say that it's caused and opened a lot of avenues of conversation for me to talk with people and share what I've learned through the interfaith dialogue I've conducted with members of Community of Christ, and to help people kind of see and understand differences. Now, it's also caused a little embarrassment for me as well, because some members of my faith haven't been as gracious as maybe they could, or tended to act like this was a major victory or anything like that. And that makes me sad and a little embarrassed, to be honest with you, too. But at the same time, I hope that what happens moving forward is that this building, which is fundamentally different in a lot of ways from the temples that members of my church now build in various places. This is functionally way different. It's an open congregational meeting space. It doesn't have any of the facilities that we currently use to practice temple ordinances. And the church has announced that it will stay as a historic site, that it's not going to be altered or changed. So the way that it's presented now to the public and has been by Community of Christ will continue essentially, but with different stewards that go forth. And it actually reopens on Monday, March 25th is when it officially reopens for visitors. This time the stewards will be people from my church. So it's interesting to participate in current religious history. It's also Wonderful to see the Kirtland Temple mentioned in the same meeting as the Hagia Sophia, which is such a beautiful and wonderful structure as well. Haven't had a chance to visit myself, but as a admirer of sacred architecture, it's nice to see us included. And thank you for inviting us. So that's what I have to say. I'll cede my time to the next person.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor. And I'm so glad you could be here. And this is, I hope that there's more room for conversations like this going forward. This is the last speaker I will introduce, and then I will cede my introduction duties over to Jackson Washburn. But I had to do this one because I have to thank Father Lucas Lynn Christensen. When Father David Williams, who is supposed to speak tonight as well, sent me a message that he was very, very ill and was not getting any better and needed to rest, I immediately texted Father Lucas, and he was on his way. For those of you who don't know the Greek Orthodox, the Orthodox Lent began on Monday. On Wednesday nights during Lent, a pre-consecrated liturgy, a certain kind of mass is celebrated, and he was on his way to do that, and he got a text message from me that said, "What are you doing tomorrow night? There's nothing special tomorrow night. What are you doing, Father?" And he very, very graciously agreed to do this. So other than being a very good egg, Father Lucas Lynn Christensen is a priest in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America and a PhD candidate in theology at Notre Dame University, not Notre Dame, I get scolded, with a concentration in liturgical studies. He specializes in sacred arts, homiletics, architecture, and iconography. He is a graduate research fellow on the interdisciplinary project assessing the impact of sacred art on individual experience, memory, and spiritual understanding. You see why I texted him. His publications include the Deifying Sacrifice, Thysia in the Eucharistic Prayers of Byzantine Basil, and the forthcoming The Church as Type and Image, Maximus the Confessor's Ecclesiastical Mysticology in light of the Carthaginian church architecture. I'm sure it's a banger, Father, and I will turn it over to you.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks for having me. The presentation I'm going to give gives a little bit of background on Hagia Sophia from its beginnings, and also the attitudes that the East Roman or Byzantine community had toward it. And let me just make sure that my share screen is operating. We can see that? All right. So oftentimes I will give this talk or a talk very much like it in the context of classes on either Byzantine art history or the history of Christian architecture. So there we go. That's what you get. So the Hagia Sophia that we know as Hagia Sophia or Hagia Sophia in Greek is actually not the first building to occupy the space and the role that it has. It has now garnered, parallel to the attitudes and the ideas that Philip had mentioned within the Turkish consciousness, it has similar ideas within the Byzantine Orthodox consciousness as well. I'm not really going to dwell on that, but I have to have this sort of halcyon image of, oh, the sunlight and a sort of photoshopped cross placed back on the dome and the absence of minarets. This is the sort of stuff that gets put out there as this sort of like imagined repatriation of Hagia Sophia. So it looms very large in that consciousness. But Hagia Sophia actually begins its life, the first basilica, which you can see in the foreground here, is inaugurated by Emperor Constantine the Great, but it's not completed until after his death by Constantius in about 360. It's the cathedral church of Constantinople, which is the sort of the new Roman capital. And it's named eventually Hagia Sophia, but originally it's just the Great Church. Constantinople doesn't really have sites of martyrdom. At this point, it's a it was Byzantion or Byzantion. It was kind of a trading post that had been colonized uh, a long time before, but it was not anything to write home about. So Constantine was basically building a whole new city, whole cloth, and this church occupies this space, ends up being named for holy wisdom, or really Jesus Christ, the holy wisdom of God. And so that first building, it ends up being remodeled, but it's burned down in a riot called the Nika riot. We're not really going to get into all of the particularities of that, but it's important because this happens under Emperor Justinian, and in 537 he recompletes this new Hagia Sophia. Now, the new Hagia Sophia, it takes about 6 years to build. It's a rush job. It's magnificent, it's huge. We'll talk a bit more about the architecture in a little bit. What's interesting, though, is for Justinian, of course, this is very much tied into his political sort of legitimacy in the face of these riots. He's always been this contested, kind of a controversial figure. He's not from a sort of a patrician family. And so he builds this magnificent church to make a statement about his legitimacy. I can't really speak to his personal piety, but there's certainly a lot of imperial propaganda baked into the architecture and into the building itself. Interestingly, the two that are designed to, or that are picked to design Hagia Sophia, Anthimos and Isidoros, are not Christians. They're actually both Greek Neoplatonists. And so this is an interesting kind of a transitional period in Justinian's administration. His court official whom he taps to hire and to hire designers and to have the thing built is himself a Neoplatonist, a Greek, the word that we're not using anymore, pagan. This is before Justinian ends up clearing all people who are not Christian from his administration, and not long before. But what ends up happening then is this space ends up reflecting some geometrical principles of light, expansiveness, roundness that end up becoming interpreted by the Christian community in particular ways. I underline all that not only to mention the sort of the many different religious traditions that have sort of touched Hagia Sophia, but also to talk about the fact that when I talk about the symbolism that will be applied to it, we can't assume any of that was baked into the building by the original designers. This is this is a nice view of the church. This is actually this view I chose specifically because this is actually the front of Hagia Sophia. Almost everybody shows it from the side. The reason why is there's actually a lovely promenade that this is still the front. There's a lovely promenade that goes, and you'll always see these piers. But the front used to have an atrium, and the people would approach the church. It was part of, I'm going to skip forward. It was a part of this imperial complex that you can see it here, but the whole imperial complex is here. And as a part of the imperial complex, and in fact, as a part of the city as a whole, Hagia Sophia forms a sort of a spiritual centerpiece, but it doesn't really stand alone. It actually stands within a whole constellation of churches and civic spaces. And in the imperial Byzantine Christian liturgy, and you really can't separate. I mean, it's difficult to talk about politics or faith at this point because they're pretty much, in Justinian's reckoning, they're symphonized. And so emperors participate in church processions, the church prays for the empire, and these processions would be these magnificent affairs that would go along these long streets, and they would stop in fora, like the Forum of Constantine. There would be prayers, they'd continue, and then they would end at whatever church that the liturgy was going to be celebrated at. Many of those, of course, were going to be at Hagia Sophia, indicated by the green dot here. What I'm getting at here is that the church itself is not a self-contained sacred space, but rather it's a sacred space that is intended to function within a constellation of sacred spaces. That atrium that has been that's no longer there, and the whole space has been truncated. What we were looking at was some buttresses that were added to stabilize the wall here. People would come in these processions to this large atrium. They would enter into this is a theoretical reconstruction of what the atrium may have looked like. They would enter in, they would pass the fiali, this fountain where they could wash themselves and do ablutions before entering the church. And then they would come to the monumental narthex. The narthex, we take for granted in a lot of Christian architecture now that churches will have narthexes, entryways, but the narthex itself in Hagia Sophia was a zone of ritual participation. This is where the emperor and the bishop would actually meet. Their processions would culminate here before their entry into the church. And so this central portal here was called the royal doors, because this is the entrance, this is the door that the emperor himself and the patriarch would use when coming in. You can see the lovely book-matched marble revetment. This is original. The exterior of the church used to have marble cladding as well. These mosaics, these figural mosaics, are much later. And I'm going to show you some reconstructions, but moving along, the thing about the church itself, as I'm pulling up my notes, is it's not the first pendentive dome structure to have been completed, but it's the first one to have been completed on this scale. It's thought that the baths of Caracalla were an antecedent to this building, but the whole goal, even though this structure retains essentially a basilica form, the whole goal is to encapsulate as much space, spaciousness and airiness and light as possible. And so I'm not going to really belabor the architectural points, but you can see how they use these pendentives, these triangular shapes, to move from the dome to the square without the use of intervening columns to disrupt sight lines within the nave itself. This is very important in order to give the overall effect of light, spaciousness. This is a reconstruction of what is generally accepted to be the liturgical disposition of the space when it's constructed. So the processional route would continue here, and in roughly the center, a little bit east of center of the church, there would be a colossal pulpit structure called an ambo. And that structure would not only be where the scriptures would be read and the sermon would be preached, but it was large enough that the choir itself would gather underneath. This, of course, has the effect of centering the proclamation and the singing of the word, but it also has the practical effect of making use of the dome, which is a monumental resonating chamber. The sound ends up lifting up into the dome, charging, and then coming back down and being redistributed throughout the space with something like a 14-second decay. The reverb in this space is incredible. There is a structure here called a temblon, which would be a chancel screen that was open, and eventually curtains were added. The altar and a synthronon, or a throne where the patriarch, other bishops, and the presbyters would sit at the appropriate times during the services. The people would be throughout, and the imperial loge is thought to have been here. And at various times, and according to different theories, women may have been in the north aisle on the ground level, in the galleries, both. It's not agreed on exactly where they would have been, but the empress, it's generally agreed, was on the gallery level here at the western end with a clear and uninhibited sightline. And this is the sort of light, kind of play of light and gold and marble, according to current scholarly reconstructions of not only how that marble would have looked and the gold before the mosaics were added later, but also the interplay with Roman glass, because the older form of glass would have had a different light diffusion than it has now. Similar light studies and these reconstructions give an idea of what this place would have looked like, and we're actually seeing it from an empress's eye view from the gallery on the western side. So the space is resplendent with gold and light, and a lot of time has been spent trying to figure out what Anthimos and Isidoros were talking about what they were trying to build with this, Platonic ideas of light and illumination. Whatever they were thinking, we don't have any record of what it was that they intended. But what we do know is that for the Christians who inhabited and used this space, it ends up being spoken of, and initially by a Byzantine court official, Pavlos Teleniarios, or Paul the Silentiary, which is a type of imperial secretary. And he gives a very famous ekphrasis, or a description, a poetic description of Hagia Sophia. And in it, he uses a lot of it is an imperial propaganda piece. I mean, the whole beginning, the whole ending is all Justinian is great, isn't he wonderful? But the middle of it is an extended meditation on the church as a cosmological paradise. So he uses motifs that are not unknown in even classical Greek rhetorical ekphrasis, but he ends up employing them in such a way as to reconstruct the vision of Hagia Sophia for his hearers as being an Edenic paradise. He uses terms that are, his entire language is quite Homeric, and he uses terms like alsos and temenos, which look back toward sacred groves and precincts, natural settings with temples in them. He's constantly referring to the columns as being like trees dappled with flowers. He talks about the golden vaults, which at this time have no figural mosaics. Those will come later under the Macedonian Renaissance. There are images that will be on the temblon and on the altarware, but this space he interprets as the heavens themselves. We don't have the reconstruction doesn't have the multi-level chandeliers, which you can see a later version of them, but these chandeliers that he refers to are set at different heights, and he interprets them as representing the stars in the heavens, and even identifies them with specific constellations. The floor, he remarks, is as the sea, and the amvon, which would have jutted out to here, is like an isthmus coming from the heavens and projecting into the created world. All of this, which is to say, he parallels, not explicitly, but implicitly, with interpretations given to the Hebrew tabernacle and temple, which, going all the way back to Philo, are interpreted as cosmological icons, images of the entire world, in fact, the entire cosmos in miniature and idealized. And Pavlos seems to be doing the same thing. And those themes end up having an influence not only on later generations' views of Hagia Sophia, but also the general view of sacred architecture in the Byzantine Christian East. I'm going to skip forward. So we have these vaultings. We have some of the uncovered images of seraphim. In the dome was initially a large icon, image of the cross. Eventually, it was an icon of Jesus Christ the Almighty, which adorns domes in a lot of Orthodox churches to this day, almost normatively, but not exclusively so. The image of Mary, the Mother of God, with Christ enthroned on her lap, would have been set, intentionally or no, directly opposite the Empress, who would have been at a similar height, a little bit lower, but there would have been that sort of a direct sight line between Empress and Mary, which makes sense when considering that this, the predecessor mosaic, would have been constructed in the semi-dome after the abolition of iconoclasm, which was really championed by Empress Irene. And so there is an interplay between the Empress, the earthly Empress, and the heavenly Queen. I'm going to skip forward. This I've been saying, I was just saying how the Empress would stand here, and here's that direct line of sight that I was talking about between the Empress's spot here on this miniature omphalion, directly opposite the Mother of God there. This is just another reconstruction of what it would have looked like with a Western view. Here again is the monumental amvon. More ideas from the gallery, just another kind of a line. Again, these reconstructions were done by a group that was trying to get a sense of what the light dispersion and diffusion would have been like with the original Roman glass in Hagia Sophia. And before the mosaics, it gives a sense of just luminescence, and a general kind of idea. Almost you can imagine maybe with the clouds of incense, there being a sort of a poetic allusion to the Shekinah in the Hebrew tabernacle. I'm not going to do the audio portion of this because I don't know that that's going to work today. But all that is to say, what ends up happening is Hagia Sophia is built by an emperor who is seeking to legitimate his place in an empire which he is now seeing as synthesized and symphonized, symphonia is Justinian's word, together with the earthly Byzantine Empire. And it ends up becoming interpreted by speakers both within the imperial court and within the church as Eden restored, a new paradise, as functioning iconographically in the same way that the tabernacle and the temple did. And it will end up influencing not only architecturally, but in terms of its perception and reception, it will end up influencing for the next 1,500 years, Eastern Christian ideas about church architectural symbolism and its interpretation. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Father Lucas. Really appreciate it. Our next speaker is Pastor John Hamer, who serves as the 40th pastor of Community of Christ Toronto congregation, which was first organized in 1836 and has today grown to become the church's largest online ministry. Among his many contributions to the history of the Latter-day Saint movement, John created the illustrations for House of the Lord, the story of the Kirtland Temple. John's great-great-great-great-grandparents, I think I got all the greats there, Stephen and Nancy Winchester, helped build the Kirtland Temple in the 1830s. He is a past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association and has organized and participated in numerous academic conferences, cultural symposia, and spiritual retreats at the Kirtland Temple over the past 2 decades. As part of his online ministry, John frequently lectures on a wide variety of topics within the fields of history, theology, and philosophy. These lectures can be found at Toronto Congregation's at Center Place YouTube channel, which currently has 69,000 subscribers and over 12 million views. Congrats, that's very impressive, John. And we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jackson. Thanks so much. Well, like Casey, I was terribly shocked the news about Kirtland Temple, and I hadn't been informed until after the sale was final, and I hadn't imagined actually that such a thing was in the works. But I want to say I feel no upset nor any ill will toward any members of the LDS Church in relation to the transaction. Actually, I have very wonderful connections and respect for the professionalism of LDS historians and the LDS Church History Department. I've been able to work with them as in my career as a map maker for some of their projects, and Casey and I are part of the John Whitmer Historical Association together. So that said, many of members of my church are in various stages of grief about this news, myself included. Including concerns about the process and how such a significant decision was made by our leaders without bringing it to the membership. So I want to talk, if I can share my slides here. Is that working? Thank you. So I want to talk about the Kirtland Temple in Community of Christ identity. We routinely tell our story, the Latter-day Saints story, from the headquarters and the leader perspective, but I want to tell it again from the perspective of one of the branches or the congregations, the local congregations, and indeed from the perspective of my own little congregation here in Toronto. So the Latter-day Saint restoration movement began in 1830 on the other side of Lake Ontario in upstate New York, right where I'm sitting here in Toronto, just the other side of the lake. It's just a few months after organizing the church, Toronto, or maybe Kingston, but became one of the first places that early members in New York deliberately visited in response to a what's sometimes called the Toronto Copyright Revelation, an attempt to raise funds by selling the right to publish the Book of Mormon in British dominions, which didn't work out at all. But a second and more successful Toronto revelation inspired the apostle Parley P. Pratt to travel to the city, where he met and baptized John and Leonora Taylor in 1836. They organized a branch or congregation of the church here, setting apart John Taylor to serve as its very first pastor. The little branch thrived for a time and held cottage meetings 2 blocks west of where I'm sitting in the Toronto Center Place Church today. At the time, the movement's center of gravity was still very close to here in Kirtland, Ohio, which today is a little over a 4-hour drive from here. Part of the movement's allure was gathering to build up a new Jerusalem, the North American continent, city of Zion, a kind of utopian city that might at first glance look like just about any other town in the American Midwest, which back then was just the West, except for one key difference. Whereas the plats of every other city centered on a public square designated to build an impressive civic courthouse, Zion was to be centered on a temple lot where Latter-day Saints would raise a house for the Lord. The allure of gathering continually drained the Canadian branches of converts who immigrated away, including Artemus Millet, who became the superintendent for the construction of the Kirtland Temple in 1833. And just 5 years later, the economy of Kirtland was shattered by the church's banking fiasco, which caused the movement's center of gravity to shift west as Joseph Smith and other leaders fled Ohio to rear up Zion again, first in Missouri, and then beginning in 1839 in Nauvoo, Illinois. By this time, the congregation's first pastor, John Taylor, and his wife felt the call to gather, and they left their Toronto flock. Arriving in Illinois, he was called to be an apostle and would eventually end his career in Utah as Brigham Young's successor. Canadian converts were immigrating in such numbers that, according to our tradition, the road west in Ontario was named the Nauvoo Road. Everybody was leaving and going to Nauvoo, and if you take the 402 highway west from London, Ontario to Sarnia, there's still a prominent exit marked Nauvoo Road. Nevertheless, although the focus of the movement was on the leader, the prophet, and the gathering place of the church's headquarters with its new, albeit incomplete, temple, the majority of members continued to live in branches like my little congregation here in Toronto. These are the branches that are mentioned in the United States. I don't have the ones for North America like Toronto, but mentioned in the church's newspaper in Nauvoo. When Joseph Smith was assassinated in 1844, the entire church was roiled, but in some ways the chaos was worse at the center. In the branches, which communicated with the center primarily by subscriptions to church newspapers and through the preaching of visiting elders, church life, meetings on Sundays and throughout the week might have continued relatively unchanged for all the uncertainty of what might come next. What came next was division as rival leaders emerged, organized competing headquarters with their own newspapers and traveling elders, and so members in branches like Toronto might receive a copy of the Messenger and Advocate from Pittsburgh and look favorably on Sidney Rigdon's organization, only to have their heads turned by the claims of James J. Strang when elders from his headquarters arrived with the copy of the Voree Herald. And though the center of gravity of Brigham Young's organization moved ever further west to the Great Salt Lake, many Latter-day Saints in the Midwestern and Eastern diaspora would have received his newspaper and looked favorably on his claims. Polygamy had been the proximate cause of both Joseph Smith's assassination, the collapse of Nauvoo, and the emergence of rival headquarters factions, and Latter-day Saint polygamy was an open scandal and regular fodder for exposés in non-Mormon newspapers. But members in distant branches like Toronto were shielded from the truth of it, since church newspapers always issued pious denials. That changed in 1849 when one of the factional leaders, the prophet James J. Strang, previously an ardent opponent of polygamy, publicly reversed course and became an advocate of the practice, openly living with multiple wives in his new Zion on Beaver Island in Lake Michigan, while he was simultaneously serving in the Michigan State Legislature. Some Midwestern saints then gathered around the leadership of William Smith, the last surviving brother of the church founder in Illinois, before finding out in 1851 that he too had been secretly practicing polygamy. So many ardent opponents of polygamy in the diaspora branches switched their allegiance, ironically, to Brigham Young's distant headquarters, but in 1853, Brigham Young's newspapers changed from their own policy of pious denials to openly admit that he and his followers in Utah were fully committed to the practice. So the new organization that became Community of Christ, my church, drawn from representatives of the diaspora branches that rejected polygamy and the leaders and organizations that advocated the practice, began to take shape that same year. From a diaspora of branches that looked occasionally to different competing headquarters in the period between 1844 and 1853, it is really only after 1853 that the movement now begins to achieve a complete division between fully separated pro-polygamy churches and anti-polygamy churches. So this is already a long story, and I've thus far said very little about the Kirtland Temple. But I think it's important to tell it from this perspective that's never told, the perspective of members in the branches like my congregation in Toronto. At some point in the chaos and disgust, Latter-day Saints stopped meeting regularly here, and our branch fell into what we call disorganization, which just means we're not meeting anymore. But throughout the 1860s and 70s, there continued to be old Latter-day Saints who remembered back when Joseph Smith had visited the city and preached at the branch back in 1837. One such member was William Hall, who had worked as a clerk for fellow Canadian William Law, a prominent leader in Nauvoo. So after Nauvoo's fall, Hall had returned to Toronto, and when representatives of this new organization, this reorganization of the church that became Community of Christ, reorganized the branch here in 1876, Hall and others reactivated and began to meet again regularly. At the turn of the 20th century, most diaspora Latter-day Saints east of the Rocky Mountains had been gathered into the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now Community of Christ. And meanwhile, although the Utah-based Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had almost no presence east of the mountains, the scandal of polygamy captured the attention of all non-members everywhere. So there's a little book called Landmarks of Toronto, published in 1904, that includes a general directory of churches in the city, and it captures the issue of identity that my congregation faced. So the description of my little congregation is entitled, quote, Latter-day Saints, popularly known as the Mormon congregation. The text reads, in a small, unpretentious brick building on Camden Street meets each Sunday for worship what is now known as the Reorganized Church of the Latter-day Saints, or as they are more generally spoken of, the Mormon congregation. The singular body present in themselves a very strange contradiction. They claim to be the only body of real Christians existing, that they are the Church of Christ as founded by the Savior of mankind and his apostles. The contradiction is that every other body of professing Christians, Romanist or Protestant, pronounce them heretical and look with profound distrust upon their doctrines and reject all communication with them as Christians. So the little book goes on to tell the Latter-day Saints story that I've just told, but it indicates, quote, the Latter-day Saints of Toronto disavow Brigham Young completely, saying that they are followers not of him, but of Joseph Smith III, citing celestial marriage or polygamy and, quote, other heresies as the source of the division. So the catalog concludes, the Latter-day Saints have had a troubled and checkered existence in Toronto, and their numbers are very small. The congregation does not appear to be increasing to any great extent, though by out-of-door preaching and circulating literature, they strive hard to increase the number of adherents. So diaspora Latter-day Saints in Toronto were thus contesting identity, not just with their rivals in Utah, but also with their non-member neighbors in the broader community of the city, who popularly called them the Mormon congregation and associated them with Brigham Young, with Utah, and with polygamy. In the contest for identity, members in Toronto lacked numbers. So for legitimacy, they turned to the fact that their leader, Joseph Smith III, was the eldest son and heir of the martyred founder, Joseph Smith Jr., and they claimed that they'd maintained the original doctrines of the Latter-day Saint movement, that polygamy was just a Utah heresy. This contest over legitimacy and originality, in this contest, the Kirtland Temple took on an essential role. Brigham Young's successors claimed to be the true heirs of the Latter-day Saint restoration, but we would say we own the original Mormon temple. And our temple is not like Utah temples. It is not a place of secret rituals, of baptisms for the dead, of polygamous sealings. It represents what we think the original idea of the movement was before the introduction of what we were calling heresies. Before our church became more historically minded and less sectarian, when we were more vocally partisan, the temple's forward plaque was inscribed with the hostile legend, "House of the Lord, built by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1834, reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in succession by decision of court, February 1880, citing our partisan interpretation of a civil lawsuit in Ohio, which we claimed was proof that our church was legally the original church." Tendentious claim at best. As the Utah Saints expanded out from their Rocky Mountain Kingdom in the 20th century, returning to Toronto and other parts of Canada and the United States they'd previously ceded, the remnant of the original diaspora, including members of my own congregation, continued to find their identity expressed in the Kirtland Temple. Although our archives include few historic photos of actual church services in Toronto, we have preserved scores of photos of multiple bus trips members took to Kirtland over the decades. Such bus trips became so important that one church family in Ontario, the Batters, created the Batter Bus Touring Company, which exists to this day. As recently as 2015, I led a pilgrimage of 2 Batter buses full of Canadian church members for a spiritual retreat at the Kirtland Temple. So central is the Kirtland Temple to our identity that the only cross-border trip I took during the pandemic lockdowns was to Kirtland so that we could film a Christmas Eve sermon for our Beyond the Walls online global ministry from the temple's pulpit. The temple is on the cover of the Sacred Identity narrative that I co-wrote with David Howlett, who is one of the panelists today, and with Barbara Walden, the head of the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, book Community of Christ, An Illustrated History. Kirtland Temple is on the cover that I designed for the first of our church's 3-volume history, written by church historian Mark Shearer, now retired. There is a picture right here on the wall of Kirtland Temple in the Toronto Centre Place. All of our imagery in the Toronto Centre Place is designed to illustrate and teach our identity, just like stained glass windows do. There's a picture here of the Nauvoo historic sites that were also part of the sale. And I designed lessons and coloring pages featuring Kirtland Temple to teach our children here in Toronto church identity. And so we're now in a place where the leaders of our church have sold the Kirtland Temple to leaders of the church in Utah. And the temple will, of course, continue to exist, but in some sense, the birthright that was central to the way Community of Christ, Latter-day Saints living in the diaspora have understood themselves has evaporated. So for Beyond the Walls, for our online ministry, we regularly travel all around since we have viewers in nations all around the world. And long before I'd heard the news, I had actually planned this year to travel to Istanbul, to Constantinople, to the new Christian Rome, to consider its history as a past and present capital of Christendom, to kind of share my thoughts and insights from its sacred spaces with my ministry, with the Beyond the Walls global community. When I go now and visit Hagia Sophia for the first time, the pilgrimage is going to take on many new resonances for me. Eastern Greek-speaking Christians have long contested our shared inheritance with their Western Latin-speaking cousins. In late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, Constantinople hardly had a peer. It was still the center of a Christian Roman Empire. The papacy, while making the pretense to primacy, sat in the ruins of a past capital amid a sea of hostile newcomers. When the West began to revive and more fully contested the legacy of the Christian Roman Empire, Charlemagne, I think, clearly saw that Constantinople, with its sacred spaces, and above all, the Hagia Sophia, was a source of legitimacy he lacked. At enormous and effectively unprecedented effort for the 8th century West, he built the grandest church constructed in living memory. For that era, the early Middle Ages, at Aachen in Germany. And this was an imitation of San Vitale and Ravenna, the last capital of the Western Empire. And Ravenna's church, San Vitale, was built similar time to Hagia Sophia, and I think it was actually maybe itself kind of a tiny, beautiful imitation of it. Over time, as the Latin West increased and the Greek East declined politically, economically, and militarily, the arenas for contesting identity shifted, and for a very dark time during the Crusades of the 13th century, Latins actually occupied Constantinople and installed a Latin patriarch in Hagia Sophia. As the end approached, desperate Eastern emperors were willing to sell or subordinate Eastern religious identity to the papacy in exchange for military assistance desperately needed to push back Turkish invaders. And I remember visiting the Vatican a few years ago and seeing frescoes commemorating the reunion of the churches at the Second Council of Lyon in 1272, which included ambassadors from the Emperor Michael VIII Palaeologos. In those frescoes, the clergy are singing the creed in songbooks, open to the passage that reads in Latin and Greek, the filioque, the double procession. In other words, it's a reunion that is commemorated as a Latin victory in Greek subordination. And so it's no wonder that it didn't hold. The contested identity continued, and for Eastern Christians, the continuance included the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, the conversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque. The contested identity as heir to empire is now not simply East and West between Christians, but then also included new heirs, Islam and the Turkish people. The contested identity, the competing perspectives over a common inheritance continue to this day. And so I will be thinking of the ongoing lived reality of Eastern Christians as I make a pilgrimage to this amazing holy space. And I will continue to ponder my own church's sacred identity, given the new reality of Kirtland Temple as we move forward as Community of Christ.
Thank you so much for your words, John. We'll move on to Professor David Howlett, a specialist in American religions. David Howlett has taught at Kenyon College, Skidmore College, and Bowdoin College. And yes, I did look up how to pronounce that last one. His work highlights how religious minorities participate in the construction of centers and peripheries, manage internal dissent and difference, and develop strategies to distinguish themselves from and proffer critique of more powerful groups. Howlett's first book, Kirtland Temple, The Biography of a Shared Mormon Sacred Space, is a historical ethnography set in the late 20th century America that delineates the rival claims, narratives, and practices of multiple Mormon groups at a contested pilgrimage site in Ohio. It was awarded the Best First Book Award from the Mormon History Association. His second book, Mormonism, The Basics, is the only Mormon studies text that provides sustained comparative analysis of the three major traditions within Mormonism, and as such, illustrates how young religions diversify over time and work out their place within a larger culture. Howlett's current research projects analyze the consequences of new network formations within contemporary Mormon denominations, with the first project decentering the dominant American-based narrative of Mormonism by documenting late 20th century global exchanges between small Mormon denominations in America, subsistence farming Highland peoples in eastern India, and converts from a small Adventist church in the Philippines. His second project, co-researched with Nancy Ross, offers a history of Mormon women's ordination movements, investigating how women's ordination advocates formed new interfaith relationships and transformed their ability to claim power for themselves. In his scholarship, Howlett is consistently focused on broader themes in the study of religion, such as pilgrimage, globalization, indigeneity, conflict, class, race, gender, and authenticity. Professor Howlett, thank you so much.
I think that was taken from my faculty page, so that was a mouthful. Thank you, Jackson. So I'm getting over pneumonia, so I think my voice will be okay, but I'll share my screen and let's go to, go to my, oh, sorry. I need to go to this and slideshow. You're seeing a lot of images of the Kirtland Temple today. So there you go. Kirtland Temple, a contested shared pilgrimage site. 3 sets of chimes rang through the air of a small chapel, honoring the triune God. A picture window in the chapel opened to a view of the Kirtland Temple. A candle was lighted in the chapel, and a reader at the front solemnly greeted a small group of worshipers. Quote, "Welcome to the quiet of this sacred place as we gather to worship. Each day in the Independence Temple, dedicated to the pursuit of peace, we pray to God for peace in our world. In addition, each day we pray for a different country. Here at the Kirtland Temple, we lift our voices in prayer as well. Today we will hold up the people of China in our prayers." Unquote. It was just after 1 o'clock on the afternoon of July 11th, 2008, and the liturgically centered service progressed. I glanced around the meditation chapel and saw 3 Kirtland Temple staff members in chairs around a simple centerpiece for worship. A Community of Christ woman on vacation had also stopped to attend the short 20-minute service. I would see her again at a service a week later, and I would learn that she had attended the Kirtland Temple Prayer for Peace twice on a 3-week vacation across the United States. After a time of hymn singing and silent prayer for various concerns, the service ended with a chime sounded once, signifying God's unity. I wandered out of the chapel and immediately saw LDS pilgrims thronging the Kirtland Temple Visitor Center's mercantile or bookstore. They bought postcards and replicas of copies of early LDS scriptures. Other LDS pilgrims sat in the Visitor Center foyer and chatted as they waited for a new tour of the temple to begin. Although an announcement over the Visitor Center intercom had invited all to the daily prayer for peace in the meditation chapel, none of the LDS pilgrims attended. This was typical. During my field work during the summer of 2008 and 2009, I never once met an LDS pilgrim who had attended the daily prayer for peace. On tight itineraries that included sites owned by the LDS Church near Kirtland Temple, LDS pilgrims had to keep to their schedules. More importantly, they visited the Kirtland Temple to confirm their faith in their own church rather than to participate in a worship ritual deeply connected to contemporary Community of Christ identity. LDS guests, in essence, were visiting a very different place for very different reasons than the lone Community of Christ pilgrim I observed at the Prayer for Peace. But what I observed that day in 2008, I later named as parallel pilgrimage in a book I wrote about the Kirtland Temple. Parallel pilgrimage, I argued in academies, and we always have our terms, we have to make ourselves sound important. This is the sound important sentence. It is constituted by a dialectical relationship between contestation and cooperation. Okay, here we go. Contestation at a site may heighten a site's relationship, a site's sacrality, as religious groups worry that a place is in danger of appropriation by a religious competitor. Sacrality, as Jonathan Z. Smith asserted, is about marked attention, and contestation dramatically draws attention to a pilgrimage site. Yet cooperation is also needed at a sacred site, since competing groups must form alliances to get access to resources or relationships otherwise denied. You could liken this situation to the notion of surface tension on a soap bubble. Too much air pressure from one side or the other on the soap bubble's soapy skin bursts the fragile structure. The right amount of surface tension, however, allows the bubble to retain its shape. It's a pretty fragile metaphor, actually. Similarly, too much contestation may literally destroy a site. Too little contestation makes the site just unimportant. Too much cooperation may erase the religious particularities which cause a site to be important. Too little cooperation makes life at the site unmanageable and miserable for pilgrims and hosts. Parallel pilgrimage, then, retains its shape through optimal amounts of cooperation and contestation, forever being renegotiated and transformed as new groups, new interests, and new conflicts emerge. That was kind of my working definition of that from what I observed in Kirtland. So the dialectical interaction between contestation and cooperation at Kirtland has had a very long and varied history. There's the same picture that John shows. We have the same kind of resources available in the archives. Joseph Smith's temples, including the Kirtland Temple, were wonderfully versatile for many uses. Ironically, this fungibility lent itself to the splintering of temple practices as divergent followers emphasize one set of practices to the exclusion of others. As the RLDS Church emerged in the 1860s and began occupying the Kirtland Temple, the new church used the structure as a platform to air their differences with their Utah LDS cousins on issues intimately connected to LDS temples, for instance, polygamous marriages, ritual sealings of families, and rituals for the dead. RLDS members even tried to manipulate court decisions regarding the temple's ownership to legitimize their new movement as Joseph Smith's true successors, hence what you see on the front of the temple. In the same period, LDS began emphasizing stories associated with the Kirtland Temple that showed their denomination's ambivalence towards the historic structure. In the 1870s, for instance, LDS canonized a vision from Joseph Smith from April 3rd, 1836, a vision which they thought legitimized their temple rituals that they did in their own temples, a vision of Jesus, Moses, Elias, and Elijah in the worship court of Kirtland Temple. At the same time, they told lurid tales of the Kirtland Temple's later desecration by farmers penning sheep in the pew boxes, or its defilement by raucous circuses held within its walls, and both of those stories were folklore at best. A once holy site in this narrative was now but a house in the hands of religious competitors who, LDS felt, did not understand the true and real uses of temples. In the late 19th century, the temple became a center for RLDS and LDS identity formed through alterity. Oh, there you go. So I forgot I had that. So with the deaths of the first generation of Mormons, the Kirtland Temple grew in importance for both RLDS and LDS pilgrims. It served as a sacred trace of now departed holy people. Its growing importance coincided with the growth of tourism in America. In the late 19th century, the American middle class became increasingly wealthy and mobile. When this combined with a growing infrastructure of railroads and road highways in the United States, tourism grew and then blossomed into a mass affair in the early 20th century. After the Second World War, thousands of RLDS and LDS families regularly included Kirtland Temple on their vacation itineraries, as you saw with what John Hamer also shared. As the 1960s dawned, the Kirtland Temple was a place of interest for LDS pilgrims on their way east to LDS-owned sites like in New York. In contrast, it was the holiest building on earth for many RLDS members. RLDS and LDS dramatically began to alter the Kirtland Temple's surrounding landscape in the 1960s and 1970s. RLDS dominated Midwestern Mormon pilgrimage sites in this era, located in Independence, Missouri, Nauvoo, Illinois, and Kirtland, Ohio. In the 1960s and 1970s, RLDS sought to increase their hegemony in Kirtland by buying up more land surrounding the temple, as well as constructing a visitor center, a very humble one, as you can see there. That's from like the 1980s there. But this is a building from the 1969 near the temple. And then this added more to the temple as a destination, if you will. The guide center became almost like a preparatory shrine before pilgrims visited the temple itself. and simultaneously added to the temple's musealization, if that's a word. In the same era, LDS slowly began to reassert their influence in Ohio. The LDS Church opened a historic site 30 miles from Kirtland in Hiram, Ohio, and then competed with the RLDS Church for old homes in Kirtland that could be used as new historic shrines, such as the Newell K. Whitney store. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, LDS and RLDS engaged in competition with each other through their property purchases. LDS members living in Cleveland grew in numbers after World War II. The upshot of this growth was a need for a religious explanation of why a holy site in their backyard was in possession of an old religious competitor. In the mid-1970s, local LDS leaders in Cleveland, such as Carl Anderson, at that time the stake president, and Donald Brewer, at that time the mission president headed over missionaries, provided the answer to the problem by lifting up a relatively neglected LDS narrative that asserted that a scourge or curse had fallen on Kirtland. Anderson and Brewer proposed 3 ways to lift the curse: evangelism in Kirtland, the establishment of a ward or congregation in Kirtland, and the construction of an LDS visitor center in Kirtland. Anderson and Brewer convinced LDS leaders in Salt Lake City of their redemptive plan, and by 1979, all 3 solutions were approved. In a formal ceremony for the groundbreaking of the LDS ward building or congregation in Kirtland, an LDS apostle officially lifted the scourge on the land in a prayer. The Kirtland Temple went from occupying a cursed region to standing on a blessed land, and the cursing of the site simply became one stage in a larger process of site sanctification. By 1984, the formal LDS dedication of the restored Whitney store in Kirtland placed the Kirtland Temple more firmly within the realm of LDS sacred space. Over the next 20 years, Kirtland accumulated more and more LDS-operated structures. These new sites simultaneously drew on the Kirtland Temple's power as a sacred locus of LDS memory and gave LDS new ways to contest the temple's centrality. By lifting up journal accounts about heavenly messengers appearing in various buildings in Kirtland, LDS officials and laity could assert that there was more than one building in Kirtland where Jesus appeared, and the other buildings were under their control. In sum, the LDS transformation of Kirtland Temple's landscape between 1974 and 1984 showed that the manipulation of sacred space may be used to answer theological questions that shore up a group's claims to legitimacy. The mid to late 1980s witnessed a schism within the RLDS Church that had deadly consequences. RLDS guide Jeffrey Lundgren taught a small group of followers that the Kirtland Temple was to be the place for a bloody siege directly before the second coming of Jesus, who was to personally descend on the Kirtland Temple. Meanwhile, RLDS liberals commemorated the 150th anniversary of the Kirtland Temple by holding special commemorative services, a play, and a peace colloquy at the site. As the RLDS Church divided, the temple was used to promote 2 dramatically different RLDS eschatological visions for human redemption. Lundgren's vision elevated Kirtland as the most important site for the end of days and a place that could only be cleansed by blood. His vision resulted in his murder of 5 of his followers on his nearby Kirtland farm, and his own later execution by the state of Ohio. The RLDS leader's vision posited that the Kirtland Temple as a place that could inspire the non-violent action of members who sought God's peaceable kingdom made tangible on earth through social justice. This liberal vision resulted in a schism within the movement, a loss of as many as 30,000 members, and a fresh reinvention of the denomination as a peace and justice church. Kirtland, too, became one of 2 temples in the RLDS Church by the late 1980s as construction began on an independence temple dedicated to the pursuit of peace. Once a singular sacred center unmatched in importance to the RLDS, the Kirtland Temple became a more peripheral sacred shrine for them in the early 1990s. This is a John Hamer image, by the way. He made this map. So in the 1980s and 1990s, the LDS Church entered a phase of rapid temple construction across the globe. the Kirtland Temple remained outside their ownership, but the curse narrative from the 1970s asserted that the land of Kirtland was slowly being reordered and redeemed by the LDS Church. Although LDS added a temple in Columbus, Ohio in 1998, they did not attempt to build a temple in the Cleveland area, despite having enough members to justify construction of a new structure. LDS leaders clearly still had designs for the Kirtland Temple, and on at least one occasion in either 2001 or 2002, they attempted to buy the historic structure from the newly named Community of Christ, formerly named RLDS. The LDS Church finally opened their long-awaited expanded Kirtland Visitor Center in 2003. While they'd been operating the Whitney store, seen in this image, in Kirtland since 1979 as a temporary visitor center, the new, much larger center showed that the LDS leaders were ready to make Kirtland a more central part of the LDS story. They restored or reconstructed a small village too, in Kirtland, dubbing it Historic Kirtland. A much larger LDS interpretive staff, all missionaries, arrived to operate the new sites. The Community of Christ's dominance of Kirtland's geography was waning, and LDS leaders thought that the importance of the temple, the Community of Christ, was also in decline. Despite the LDS perception that the Community of Christ had given up on its heritage with its leftward turn in the 1980s, Community of Christ members invested in a new visitor center for the Kirtland Temple, finally dedicated in 2007 at a cost of $5.5 million. The visitor center had a spiritual formation center attached to it, and a full-time Community of Christ spiritual formation minister staffed the center. This in addition to a full-time historic site director for the temple. By these acts, the Community of Christ signaled that the Kirtland Temple had been reincorporated into the contemporary mission of Community of Christ. For instance, in 2007 and 2008, Community of Christ leaders held a series of retreats at the temple aimed at renewing and refocusing their spiritual lives. The temple's importance to the Community of Christ had been adapted to new circumstances, and the level of monetary commitment by the small denomination demonstrated that the Kirtland Temple would continue to be an essential part of the Community of Christ narrative about itself, until, as we found out about 2 weeks ago, when it's changed all of a sudden. So, well, I'm going to skip a section talking more about what it means to share a site, and just go to the very end about what does this mean now. Kirtland Temple is a shared place, but it's different places for LDS and Community of Christ. What will it mean now for thinking about Kirtland Temple? How will sharing change? For decades, Community of Christ has allowed other groups to schedule events in the temple after tour hours. This meant that many LDS groups and Community of Christ groups scheduled communion services in the temple. LGBTQ advocacy groups with Mormon roots also had services in the temple on a regular basis. The Associate Director of LDS Church History Department, Matt Groh, has assured folks that other services will continue in the temple as long as groups have appropriate uses for the temple. Yet many folks have concerns for what appropriate might mean. In particular, who qualifies as having appropriate uses? Will Mormon feminist groups have inherently inappropriate uses by the temple by this measure? Are LGBTQ Mormon groups, by their very identity, inappropriate? The Community of Christ has been guaranteed access to the temple for up to 6 services a year for the next 15 years. What does that mean after 15 years? The temple, too, will be kept open as a historic site for at least the next 15 years. After that, what will happen to it? As many scholars have noted, the hazards of institutionalized charismatic leadership means that dramatic reversals can happen in a short amount of time. The history of the Kirtland Temple as a shared sacred space underscores this all the more. I'll end there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate it. And big thanks to all of our panelists. I know we're perhaps around when we would wrap up, but I do want to make sure that we can bring in a handful of questions. If anyone in the audience, anyone tuning in, wants to leave them in the chat or raise their hand, I'll keep an eye out. And if not, we can also wrap things up. Hey, so sorry. I think I might have cut out there. Yeah, it rebooted a little bit for me. But let me just check the chat real quick to see if we have any questions. It doesn't. Oh, we have a question from Roman D. How does virtual tours of sacred spaces impact this discussion? Be interested to hear from anyone who wants to chime in.
Well, I noted, I don't know how this is going to play out, but I noted that for Community Christ, days before the sale of the temple, they released virtual tours of both Kirtland Temple and Nauvoo. And that now was not a coincidence. So, where they had this director of historic sites for Community Christ gave the tours. So that's interesting. So this is a story that's ongoing, obviously. So we'll think about how does this transfer of a site play out in time.
Right. And Father Lucas unfortunately had to leave. He also included some virtual graphics in his presentation regarding the Hagia Sophia, albeit perhaps a bit more of a reconstructive nature as opposed to something that's a bit more contemporaneous and lived. John, did you want to jump in?
Well, I was going to say that in addition to that video, which I think on the Community of Christ YouTube channel has more views than any other video Community of Christ has ever posted. I think there also has been, it's also been very digitally recorded so that there can be like like where you travel around through it virtually as well. So I do think that all of that kind of visits are going to be available for people and that won't be, I mean, I'm not thinking that anything's going to be impeded anyway, but that will also be, available to people who can't travel to, there are Latter-day Saints all around the world and not everyone is able to travel to Ohio. And so that extends the capacity for pilgrimage as we now experience it in new ways with technology.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. We have appreciation from the audience for the great information. I'm not seeing any additional questions. And in the interest of time, let's see, Philip. Yeah,
Just
feel free to jump in.
Yeah, not a question, but in terms of virtual resources on this, I think Father Lucas was going to say it, but didn't mention it. If y'all haven't heard the group Capella Romana's rendition of what chant would have sounded like in Hagia Sophia in the Byzantine period, you should look it up. It's astonishing. If I remember correctly, the procedure they used was at some point, maybe 10 years ago, someone went into the space and popped a balloon, recorded the acoustic effect on the space, and then did some chant from, I think, a 14th century, 13th century manuscript, and then ran the chant that was recorded through the acoustic approximation they did inside the space to recreate the echo. And you can find it on YouTube for free by Capella Romana. I think it's called Lost Voice of Hagia Sophia, something like that. Anyways, just he was going to mention it, didn't mention it, but in terms of virtual resources, it's incredible. I recommend it.
Yeah, and it reminds us that virtual does not necessarily just mean visual, but audible as well. There any other kind of last comments from any of our panelists before we wrap up?
Well, I'll just mention I'm looking forward to getting together with David and as we work on how we're telling our story now, because obviously it's a little different from how we've told it the last time we took a trip to, well, actually we took retreats at Kirtland and Nauvoo in order to write our last books on this topic. And so there's new ways to conceptualize this and envision how we tell our narrative. So.
Wonderful. Well, many thanks to our esteemed speakers, to Katie Kalidas for bringing the event together, and for Workshops in Eastern Christian Studies for formally sponsoring. We're grateful to each one of you for your contributions to tonight's program. And to clarify, Katie and I did try our best to identify and reach out to a Muslim scholar for tonight, but the demands of Ramadan made the timing unideal. And of course, we are happy to support our Muslim brothers and sisters in that respect. If anything, perhaps it gives all of us some homework as we reflect on the rich comparative tapestries presented tonight of shared sacred spaces, tensions across lines of religious difference, competing narratives centered around differing religious, if not also political and social identities, and the possibility to share sacred spaces within the shared space of scholarship. To those listening, be sure to like the Workshops in Eastern Christian Studies Facebook page to get notifications for future events such as this, and we will wrap it up there. Thank you all again, and hope you have a good rest of your night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.